In the summer of 1851, a brand new wooden sailing ship left New York Harbor, ran south the whole length of the Atlantic, fought her way around the storms of Cape Horn at the bottom of the world, and clawed back up the Pacific to San Francisco, a voyage of some 15,000 miles, in 89 days. 89 days, under sail, by wind alone. She was called the Flying Cloud, and a few years later she made the same run even faster, and the record she set for the fastest passage under sail from New York to San Francisco stood, unbroken, for 135 years. It was not beaten until 1989, and then only by a high-tech racing yacht made of modern materials with satellite weather routing. For more than a century, the fastest anyone had ever sailed from one side of America to the other was a wooden ship, built entirely by hand, in a shipyard in East Boston, in the 1850s. These were the clippers, the extreme clipper ships, the fastest wooden sailing vessels that human beings have ever built. And they were the last and greatest flowering of the age of sail. Wood and canvas and rope pushed right to the absolute physical limit of what those materials could do, by shipwrights and riggers and spar makers whose names, almost every one, have been lost. The man who built the Flying Cloud, and most of the greatest of these ships, was Donald Mackay, an immigrant who had come down from Nova Scotia with almost nothing and worked his way up from an ordinary apprentice in the shipyards to become, for one brief, brilliant decade, the finest builder of fast ships in the world. But Mackay could not have built a single one of them alone. Around him in his East Boston yard worked an army of skilled craftsmen, the men who actually cut and shaped and joined the timber, who caulked the seams, who made the towering masts and spars, who rigged the miles of line, and it was their hands, guided by his designs, that produced these miracles of speed. And driving the Flying Cloud herself to her records was another figure history nearly forgot, a woman named Eleanor Creasy, the ship's navigator, the wife of the captain, who plotted the course and read the winds and the currents that carried the ship to her records. This is the story of the fastest wooden ships ever built, of the hunger for speed that created them, and of the forgotten hands and minds that made and sailed them, in the last great age before steam and iron swept the sailing ship from the sea. If you care about the men who built this country with their hands, the workers nobody ever wrote a book about, please subscribe to Global Old History right now. Hit the button, come back. Because the clippers are among the most beautiful things America ever made, and the people who actually built them have been almost entirely written out of their own glory. To understand why anyone built ships this extreme, you have to understand the very specific hunger that created them, because a clipper ship was, above all, a machine for turning speed into money. In 1849, they found gold in California, and the world went mad for it. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people and a mountain of goods needed to get from the settled eastern United States to San Francisco as fast as humanly possible. And there was no easy way to get there. There was no canal across Panama yet, no transcontinental railroad. To go from New York to California by sea, the way most heavy cargo and many people went, meant sailing all the way down around Cape Horn, the storm-battered tip of South America, and back up the far side, 15,000 miles of open ocean. On an ordinary cargo ship, that voyage could take 5 or 6 months. And in a gold rush, time was everything. The first ship into San Francisco with a cargo of picks and shovels and flour and whiskey could sell it for staggering prices before the market was flooded. Passengers desperate to reach the diggings would pay a premium for a fast ship. Speed on that route was not a luxury. It was the whole game. Let me make that economic pressure concrete, because it is genuinely wild. When gold was discovered, San Francisco went in a matter of months from a sleepy village to a booming, chaotic city of tens of thousands of gold-hungry men, and that city needed everything and had almost nothing. It needed food, tools, clothing, lumber, whiskey, every manufactured good, all of which had to come by sea from the east or from around the world. And because demand so wildly outran supply, prices in early San Francisco were insane. A shipment of goods that had cost a modest sum in New York could sell in San Francisco for many times that, sometimes for a fortune, if it arrived while the shortage held. But that was the catch. If it arrived while the shortage held. Every day a ship was at sea was a day the market could shift, more supply could arrive, and prices could crash. So the merchant whose fast ship got there first weeks ahead of the slower vessels, could sell into a starving market at the top price and make a killing, while the goods on the ships behind him might arrive to find the price already collapsed. In that environment, the speed of your ship translated directly and dramatically into money. A ship that could cut the passage from 6 months to 3 was not just a little better. It could be the difference between an enormous profit and a total loss. And so ship owners were suddenly willing to pay premiums no one had ever paid before for pure speed, to commission ships that carried less cargo but carried it faster, because getting there first was worth more than getting there with more. That is the specific, feverish logic that called the clipper ship into being. It was not built for comfort or capacity or economy. It was built to win a race against the calendar, where the prize was a fortune in gold rush prices and the penalty for losing was ruin. And at the same time, on the other side of the world, the China tea trade was creating the same pressure, because the first ships home to New York or London with the new season's tea could command the highest prices. Two great markets, gold in the West and tea in the East, were both, suddenly, willing to pay enormous sums for one thing above all others: speed. And American shipbuilders answered with the most extreme sailing ships ever conceived. The tea trade added its own peculiar pressure, and it is worth understanding because it drove the design of these ships just as hard. Tea was one of the great commodities of the age, and there was a powerful belief, right or wrong, that the fresher the tea, the better and more valuable it was. So the first ships home from China with the new season's crop could command a premium price, and there was enormous prestige and real money in being the fastest tea ship of the year. This turned the annual voyages home from the China tea ports into genuine, famous races, with ships leaving on the same tide and crowds and bettors following their progress, the captains driving their vessels mercilessly across half the world to be first up the river with the new tea. It was sport and commerce fused together, and it rewarded exactly the same thing the gold rush rewarded: raw speed under sail, a ship that could carry a press of canvas and a hard-driving captain and simply outrun the competition. So, on two sides of the world at once, in the California trade and the China trade, the market was handing out its richest rewards to whoever could build and sail the fastest ship. That is an unusual thing in history, a moment when an entire industry's incentives pointed, with rare and total clarity, at a single quality, speed, and poured money into achieving it. And when you point that much money and that much talent at one goal, you get extremes. You get the clipper ship, sail carried to the edge of capsizing, hulls sharpened to the edge of carrying nothing, ships driven to the edge of breaking apart, all in pursuit of the one thing the whole world was suddenly willing to pay a fortune for. And there was a third great pull that I have not even mentioned yet, because in the very years the California and China trades were booming, gold was also discovered in Australia, setting off a rush there too, and creating a huge demand for fast ships to carry immigrants and goods out to the other side of the world. Mackay himself built some of his greatest ships, the Lightning among them, specifically for the Australia run. And it was on these long, hard passages down into the roaring westerlies of the far southern ocean that some of the highest speeds of all were recorded. The ships running their easting down before enormous following winds, day after day, in the loneliest and windiest waters on Earth. So the Clipper was not answering one hunger but three: California gold, China tea, and Australia gold, all at once, all in the same handful of years, all demanding the same thing. It was a rare alignment, a moment when the whole trading world seemed to want nothing but speed, and it lasted just long enough to call forth the most extreme sailing ships ever built, and then, almost as suddenly, to pass. The Clippers were children of a specific decade, and the sheer intensity of the demand that made them is a large part of why they burned so bright and so briefly. They were built for a fever, and when the fever broke, so did the market that needed them. Quick pause. If these stories matter to you, join the Boss tier for $4.99 a month. Loyalty badge, custom emoji, early access 24 hours before public, and members-only polls. Link in the description. Now back to it. Because a clipper ship was a radical thing, and it is worth understanding exactly what made it different, because everything about it was sacrificed to speed. An ordinary merchant sailing ship was built like a floating warehouse, a broad, deep, rounded hull designed to carry the maximum amount of cargo safely and economically, and it was not especially fast. Nor did it need to be. A clipper was the opposite of that in every way. It had a long, narrow, sharp hull with a knife-like bow designed to slice through the water rather than push it aside, sacrificing cargo space for the ability to move fast. And above that sleek hull, it carried an almost insane amount of sail. The masts were taller, the yards were longer, and the ship spread acres upon acres of canvas, far more than a conventional ship of the same size would dare to carry, so that the clippers were, in the language of the day, over-canvassed, driven by a press of sail that would have been considered reckless on any ordinary vessel. This was the trade-off at the heart of the clipper. It gave up the safe, profitable business of carrying bulk cargo, and in exchange it got speed, the ability to fly across the ocean under a towering cloud of sail, catching every breath of wind, driven hard by captains who were paid to take risks that would terrify an ordinary master. A clipper was not a sensible ship. It was a thoroughbred, bred for one thing, and the man who bred the best of them was Donald Mackay. There is real science in that hull, even if the men who shaped it worked by eye and experience more than by theory. The fundamental problem of moving a ship through water is that water resists, and the faster you try to go, the harder it fights back, especially as a ship approaches the speed where it starts to be trapped by the very wave system its own passage creates. The old bluff-bowed cargo ships, with their rounded, apple-cheeked bows, simply shoved the water aside and paid a heavy price in resistance, which capped their speed. The clipper builders attacked that problem with a long, fine, sharp entrance, a hull that was narrow and drawn out and knife-like at the bow, designed to part the water cleanly and slip through it rather than bulldoze it. They made the hulls longer in proportion to their width than anyone had before, because a longer hull can, in principle, be driven faster. And they balanced all of this by feel and by trial, because the mathematics of hull resistance was not yet fully understood, so a builder like Mackay was working from an educated intuition, refined ship by ship, about what shape would fly. Above the water, the rig matched the hull. To drive that sharp hull to its potential, you needed enormous power, and the only power available was the wind. So the clippers carried a staggering spread of sail on very tall masts, and added extra sails, studding sails set out beyond the normal ones on booms, to catch even more wind in light airs. The whole ship was a single integrated speed machine, the sharp hull and the towering rig working together, and getting the balance right, enough sail to drive the hull without simply pushing it over or tearing the masts out, was the art at the center of the whole enterprise. Mackay was, by common consent, the greatest artist of that balance who ever lived, and he proved it not once, but again and again, ship after ship. Now let me tell you about Mackay and the men in his yard, because this is where the real work lived. Mackay had been born in Nova Scotia, and had come to the United States as a young man to learn shipbuilding, apprenticing in the New York yards, learning the craft from the keel up, before eventually setting up his own yard across the harbor from Boston, in East Boston. And when the clipper boom came, Mackay proved to have a genius for it, an instinct for the shape of a fast hull, and the courage to build ships bigger and sharper and more heavily sparred than anyone else dared. But a shipyard is not one man. Mackay designed the ships and drove the work, but the ships themselves were built by hundreds of skilled tradesmen, and every one of them practiced a demanding craft. Mackay's own story is worth telling, because it is the immigrant craftsman's story in its purest form. He was born on a farm in Nova Scotia, in modest circumstances, and as a young man, he made his way to New York with little more than his ambition and his hands, to learn the shipbuilder's trade. He apprenticed in the New York yards, and he learned the craft the hard way, from the bottom, as a working shipwright, mastering the actual physical skills of shaping and joining timber into ships before he ever designed one. He was, in other words, not a gentleman naval architect who came to the work through school and theory. He came up through the tools. He knew, in his hands and his eye, exactly what he was asking of the men in his yard, because he had done every job himself. That is part of what made him great, and it is part of why the men worked for him the way they did. When he finally set up his own yard in East Boston, and the clipper age arrived to meet his gifts, he was ready, a master of the whole craft from the keel up, with the vision to imagine ships no one had built, and the practical knowledge to actually build them. He drove his yard hard, and he drove himself harder. And for a decade he produced a run of ships that has never been equaled. But he never forgot, and never let anyone forget, that a ship is built by many hands, and he surrounded himself with the finest craftsmen he could find because he knew that his designs were only lines on paper until their skill made them real. Before I go on, do me a favor and subscribe. The algorithm buries old industry stories unless enough people click. One click, come back. Because the building of one of these ships was a symphony of hand skills, and it deserves to be understood before we watch one fly. Consider what it took to build a clipper by hand. There were the shipwrights, the master craftsmen, who took Mackay's designs and turned them into a hull, shaping and fitting the great curved timbers of the frame, planking the sleek sides, and doing it to the fine tolerances a fast hull demanded, because on a clipper the exact shape of the hull was everything, and a clumsy line would cost speed. There were the caulkers, driving fiber into every seam and sealing it, because a ship that leaked could not be driven hard, and then there were the men who built the ship's real engine, which was its rig. The spar makers shaped the masts and the yards, and on a clipper these were enormous, the tallest masts rising well over 150 feet above the deck, each one built up and shaped by hand from great timbers, because no single tree could make a mast that tall. Just consider the masts for a moment, because they capture the whole scale of the thing. The lower masts of a great clipper were so large that no single tree could provide them, so they were built up, made of several great timbers bound and banded together into one enormous column, and then shaped true. Above the lower mast went the top mast, and above there the top gallant mast, and sometimes above that the royal mast. Each one a separate spar fitted onto the one below, so that the whole mast was assembled in sections rising well over 150 feet into the air, higher than a 15-story building, and had to be strong enough to bear the tremendous pull of the sails without snapping. The yards, the horizontal spars that carried the square sails, were themselves great timbers, the longest of them stretching most of the width of the ship, and they too had to be shaped and slung and controlled. And then there was the rigging, the vast web of rope that held it all together and made it work. The standing rigging, the fixed lines that braced the masts against the pull of the wind, and the running rigging, the movable lines that raised and lowered and angled the sails, together came to many miles of rope on a single ship. Every strand of it made of hemp, every line spliced and fitted and led by the riggers, who had to understand the whole three-dimensional puzzle of how force would travel through the rig when the ship was driving hard. A mistake anywhere in that web, a weak splice, a badly set stay, could bring a mast down in a gale and kill men and lose the ship. So the riggers' craft, like the shipwrights and the spar makers, was a matter of life and death carried out to a very high standard by men working with their hands and their accumulated knowledge, and it all had to come together into one machine that could be driven across the world's oceans at the very edge of destruction. The riggers then went aloft and set up the standing rigging that braced those towering masts, and the running rigging that controlled the sails, miles upon miles of rope, every foot of it fitted by hand. The sailmakers stitched acres of heavy canvas into the sails. When you look at a picture of a clipper ship under full sail, that vast, complex, beautiful pyramid of canvas and rope and timber towering over the water, understand that every single piece of it was made and fitted and set by the hands of a specific craftsman, and that the whole thing was, in its way, one of the most complex machines a society could build before the machine age, powered by nothing but the wind and shaped by nothing but human skill. And all of that work happened in a place, Mackay's East Boston Yard, which for a few years was one of the most remarkable industrial sites in the country. It was not a factory in the modern sense, with machines and assembly lines. It was a gathering of crafts around a building slip, where a ship took shape in the open air over many months, surrounded by the sheds and the timber and the smoke of the workshops. There was the mold loft, where the ship's lines were drawn out at full size, and the patterns for the timbers were made. There were the saw pits, and later the steam mills that cut the timber. There were the smiths forging the iron fittings, the block makers turning out the wooden pulleys by the hundred, the spar makers in their shed, the sail makers in the loft, the rope walks supplying the cordage. Hundreds of men, in dozens of trades, all converging on one hull, rising on the ways, in a choreography of skilled labor that produced, at the end, a single finished ship ready to be driven around the world. It was a spectacle in its day, and crowds turned out for the launchings, which were great civic events, the whole city coming to watch Mackay's latest creation slide down the ways into the harbor. But the crowds came to see the ship. They did not, for the most part, come to see the men who had spent the winter building her And it is those men, the anonymous hundreds of the East Boston Yard, whose skill this whole story rests on and whose names it did not keep. And the ships that came out of that yard were legends, each with its own name and record and story. There was the Staghound, one of his first great clippers, larger and sharper than the merchant world thought wise, which proved the doubters wrong. There was the Flying Cloud, the most famous of them all, with her record to San Francisco. There was the Sovereign of the Seas, and the Lightning, and the Champion of the Seas. And there was the Great Republic, the largest wooden sailing ship of her day, an enormous four-masted vessel that pushed the very idea of a wooden ship to its outer limit of size. Mackay kept building bigger and bolder, as if he were testing how far the ancient materials of wood and rope and canvas could actually be pushed, and for a few astonishing years the answer kept coming back, farther than anyone thought. Each new ship was a public event, her launching watched by crowds, her maiden voyage followed in the papers, her records argued over in every port. For that brief span, the name Mackay on a ship meant the same thing the finest names mean on the finest machines today: the top of the art, the fastest, and the best. And every one of those famous hulls was the work of the same anonymous army of East Boston craftsmen, building Mackay's visions into reality one timber and one splice at a time, a different crew of forgotten men behind each celebrated ship. One quick note, I turned the full story into a book, Everything the Records Gave Me. If you want it, the link is in the description. And then there was the Flying Cloud, Mackay's masterpiece, and her extraordinary maiden voyage, which shows you what all that craft could do when it was driven by the right people. She was launched in 1851, and within weeks, she set out from New York for San Francisco under the command of Captain Josiah Perkins Creasy. And here's the detail I love most, the one that so much of the telling leaves out. The ship's navigator, the person responsible for finding the fastest path across 15,000 miles of shifting winds and currents, was the captain's wife, Eleanor Creasy. Eleanor was a gifted and serious navigator, deeply versed in the science of the sea, in the study of winds and currents that was just then being organized into something like a system, and it was her skill at plotting the ship's course, at choosing exactly where to sail to catch the best winds and avoid the calms, that was as responsible as anything for what happened next. The Flying Cloud drove south, around the Horn and up the Pacific, and she made San Francisco in 89 days, a stunning, record-breaking passage that made her instantly famous around the world. A few years later, the same ship, with the same husband and wife team aboard, beat that record, setting a mark that would stand for 135 years. A woman navigator, at a time when women were allowed almost no public role of any kind, helped drive the fastest ship in the world to a record that outlasted almost everyone who ever doubted her. I want to give Eleanor Creasy and her craft their proper due, because navigation on a passage like that was a genuine intellectual feat, not a matter of simply pointing the ship at San Francisco. The route from New York to San Francisco was 15,000 miles of ocean with enormously varied winds, belts of steady trade winds, zones of maddening calm, the fierce westerlies of the far south, and the passage of Cape Horn. And the difference between a fast passage and a slow one lay largely in how cleverly the navigator threaded the ship through all of it, catching the favorable winds and dodging the calms, even if that meant sailing thousands of miles out of the straight-line way to do it. This was exactly the era when a naval officer named Matthew Fontaine Maury was gathering the logbooks of countless voyages and organizing the world's knowledge of winds and currents into charts and sailing directions that could tell a navigator for any part of the ocean in any season where the best winds were likely to be found. Eleanor Creasy was a serious student of this new science of the sea, and she used it brilliantly, plotting a course for the Flying Cloud that took advantage of everything then known about the winds and currents of the great oceans. Her success was not luck. It was the application of real skill and real knowledge by a woman who had mastered a demanding discipline at a time when almost every door of formal learning and public achievement was closed to her sex. She sailed with her husband as a working partner, not a passenger. And the records that ships set are as much her achievement as anyone's. That history so often files her under the captain's wife, a footnote to her husband's command, is one more example of the way the people who actually do the decisive work get written out of the story in favor of the person with the title. Eleanor Creasy navigated the fastest ship in the world to a record that stood for 135 years. She deserves to be remembered by her own name, for her own skill. And the record voyage was not a smooth, easy run, which makes it more remarkable, not less. On that maiden passage, the Flying Cloud suffered real trouble. Early on, some of her spars were damaged, sprung or carried away under the press of sail, the kind of failure that could cripple a ship's speed for the rest of a voyage. And the crew had to make repairs at sea, aloft in difficult conditions, to keep her driving. There was trouble among the crew as well, the sort of tension and even suspected sabotage that could run through a hard-driven ship with a mixed and sometimes unwilling company aboard. So the record was not set by a perfect ship gliding effortlessly across a calm ocean. It was set by a ship that was damaged and repaired and driven hard through every kind of trouble, by a captain willing to push, a navigator plotting a brilliant course, and a crew fighting the ship, and sometimes each other the whole way. That they made San Francisco in 89 days despite all of it, rather than because everything went right, tells you how much margin was built into these ships and these people, how hard they could be pushed and still perform. The clean number in the record book, 89 days, hides a messy, dangerous human story of damage and repair and conflict and sheer determination, which is, of course, exactly the kind of story the record books always hide. But I want to be honest about the cost of that speed, because driving a wooden ship that hard was brutal and dangerous, and it was where the material was pushed right to its limit. To make these record runs, the captains carried sail when a prudent man would have shortened it, driving the ship through heavy weather under a press of canvas that strained every timber and every rope to the edge of failure. A clipper under full sail in a strong wind was a machine under enormous stress. The hull worked and groaned in the seas. The masts bent under the pull of the sails. And Cape Horn, which every ship on the California run had to pass, was one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean in the world, a place of ferocious storms and towering seas and freezing cold, where ships were dismasted and wrecked and men were swept from the yards to their deaths in the icy water. The sailors who worked these ships did some of the hardest and most dangerous labor imaginable, going aloft 100 and more feet in a gale to fight wet, heavy, thundering canvas, on foot ropes, in the dark, with the ship rolling beneath them and the sea waiting below. Men fell. Men were lost overboard. Driving a clipper to a record was a team effort that ran from the navigator plotting the course down to the ordinary sailors risking their lives on the yards. And the wooden ship beneath them was being asked to do things no wooden ship had ever been asked to do, and sometimes it broke. The lives of the sailors who worked these ships deserve more than a passing mention because they paid the highest price for all that speed. Driving a clipper hard meant carrying sail in conditions where a cautious captain would have taken it in. And that meant sending men aloft, again and again, in the worst of weather, to handle canvas that had become a wet, frozen, thundering monster. Picture the work. 100 feet and more above a heaving deck, out on a foot rope slung beneath a yard, in a howling wind, in the dark, in the freezing spray off Cape Horn, a sailor had to fight with his bare hands to gather in a huge sail that was cracking and bellying and trying to tear him off into the sea. There was nothing to hold him but his own balance and his grip and the thin foot rope under his boots. Men fell from the yards to the deck or into the sea, and a man overboard from a clipper running at speed in a heavy sea was almost never recovered, simply gone, the ship unable to stop or turn back in time. The cold, the exhaustion, the constant danger, the brutal discipline of some of the hard-driving captains, all of it made life before the mast, on a crack clipper, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. And these men were, if anything, even more anonymous than the shipwrights who built the ships. They signed on for a voyage, they risked their lives to drive the ship to its record, and they scattered at the end of it, an international, rootless, forgotten workforce of sailors, without whom not one of these famous passages could have been made. When we admire the beautiful ship and its record, we should remember that the record was set by men clinging to icy yards in the dark, and that some of them did not come home. When the ships did not break, the speeds they reached were astonishing, numbers that seem impossible for a wooden sailing vessel. Another of Mackay's great ships, the Sovereign of the Seas, was clocked at 22 knots, running hard before the wind on a passage to Australia, a speed that would have seemed like fantasy to sailors of an earlier generation. Yet another Mackay clipper, the Champion of the Seas, once ran 465 nautical miles in a single day, in 24 hours. a record for a day's run under sail by a single-hulled vessel that would not be broken until the 21st century by a modern racing machine. Think about that. A wooden cargo ship, built by hand in the 1850s, sailed farther in one day than any monohull sailing vessel would manage for nearly 150 years. These were not just fast ships for their time. They reached a peak of pure sailing performance that the world would not see again for the better part of 2 centuries. And they did it with wind and canvas and the nerve of the men driving them. There grew up around all this a whole culture of the record, a competitive, boastful, dangerous, sporting spirit that ran through the clipper trade. Captains who could drive a ship to a fast passage became famous, celebrated in the newspapers, sought after by owners, and some of them earned reputations as brutal drivers who would carry sail until something carried away, and who ruled their crews with an iron and sometimes savage hand, all in the pursuit of speed. Passages were timed and compared and argued over. A ship's reputation, and her captains, and even her builders, rode on her times, and a new record was national news. It was, in its way, one of the first great popular contests of pure performance in American life, a public fascination with going faster than anyone ever had, and it drove everyone involved, the builders, the owners, the captains, to push harder and harder. That competitive fever is part of why the Clippers reached the extremes they did. It was not only the money, it was pride and fame, and the simple human hunger to be the fastest, and it pushed wooden ships and the men aboard them to feats that were sometimes glorious and sometimes fatal. The Clippers were the racing machines of their age, built and driven at the very edge of destruction, celebrated when they won and mourned when the edge caught up with them. And the whole country followed the contest as if the honor of the nation rode on how fast a ship could round the Horn. For a few glorious years in the early and middle 1850s, these ships were the pride of the country and the wonder of the world, and Donald McKay was at the very top of his powers, launching one great clipper after another from his East Boston yard, each one a little bigger and faster and more famous than the last. It was one of those brief moments when everything came together: the demand, the money, the skill, the daring, and a nation produced something at the absolute limit of what was possible. And then, as always in these stories, the world changed, and it changed fast. What killed the Clipper was the same thing that killed the Canal and the sailing warship and so much else in that century: steam and iron. A sailing ship, however fast, was at the mercy of the wind. A steamship could go in a straight line regardless of the wind, could keep a schedule, could pass through a place like the new Suez Canal that a sailing ship could not use at all. As steam engines grew more efficient, and iron, and then steel hulls grew cheaper and stronger, the economics turned against sail with brutal speed. The opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 gave steamships a shortcut to the east that cut thousands of miles off the route, and that the wind-dependent clippers simply could not take. Within a few years of that, the great sailing clippers were being driven from the most valuable trades by steamers, and the extreme clipper, that gorgeous, over-canvassed thoroughbred, became an economic dead end almost overnight. They had been built for a specific, temporary hunger, the gold rush and the tea race, and when the world found faster and more reliable ways to feed that hunger, the clippers had nowhere to go. Many were sold off into humbler trades, worked until they wore out, and broken up. The age of sail, which had lasted for thousands of years, was ending, and the clippers were its final, brightest flare before the dark. And Donald McKay himself, the genius of the whole thing, did not end rich or triumphant. The clipper boom that had made his name was brief, and when it collapsed, the demand for his extreme ships collapsed with it. He tried to adapt, he built other kinds of vessels, he even built some ships for the Navy, but the great days were over. And the man who had built the fastest ships in the history of the world lived out his later years in far more modest circumstances. His moment passed. There is something both very American and very sad in that the brilliant maker who catches one perfect wave of history, rides it to a height almost no one ever reaches, and is then left behind when the wave breaks and the world moves on. It is worth sitting with the speed of that collapse, because it is startling. The extreme clipper had its true glory for barely a decade. The ships that made McKay world famous were built in a rush in the early and middle 1850s. And by the 1860s, the writing was already on the wall. And by the 1870s, the game was essentially over. A technology that represented the absolute pinnacle of a craft thousands of years old, the sailing ship perfected, was rendered obsolete within the working lifetime of the men who built it. Think about what that meant for those men. A shipwright who had spent years mastering the incredibly demanding craft of building a wooden clipper, who was among the most skilled workers in the country at what he did, watched the entire market for that skill evaporate as iron and steam took over, and the great wooden shipyards fell quiet one by one. The knowledge those men held, the accumulated craft of building fast wooden ships by hand, which had reached its highest peak ever in exactly their generation, became, almost overnight, a skill the world no longer needed. It did not transfer neatly to the new world of iron hulls and steam engines, which required different trades and different knowledge. So the clipper builders were not just left behind economically, their entire art was orphaned by history at the very moment it reached perfection. And that, more than anything, is the tragedy under the beauty of the clipper ships. They were the finest expression of a way of building and sailing that was, even as they flew, already dying. They were a sunset, mistaken by everyone who watched them for a sunrise. And yet, unlike the shipwrights, the ships themselves were not entirely forgotten, and that is worth a moment. The clippers were so beautiful, and their records so extraordinary, that they lodged permanently in the national imagination in a way few working machines ever do. Long after the last of them had rotted or been broken up, they lived on in paintings and prints and ship models, in the names of the record passages, in the very word clipper, which came to mean anything sleek and fast. They became a symbol of a lost age of grace and daring, the last and loveliest thing the age of sail ever produced, and people who know nothing else about 19th century shipping still know the image of a clipper under full sail. So the ships got their immortality, of a kind. The famous captains kept their names. Donald Mackay is remembered, and rightly. But the men who actually built the beautiful things, whose skill made the records possible, got none of that. The ship is remembered. The shipwright is not. It is the oldest pattern in all these stories, and the clippers, for all their glory, follow it exactly. When I look at the old images of those ships now, the Flying Cloud and the Sovereign of the Seas and the rest, under their towering clouds of canvas, I think about everything and everyone that went into them. Donald Mackay, the immigrant apprentice who became the greatest shipbuilder in the world. Eleanor Creasy, the navigator whom the record books so often reduce to the captain's wife, plotting her course across an ocean at a time when the world told women to stay home. And behind them, the hundreds of forgotten craftsmen in the East Boston Yard, the shipwrights and caulkers and spar makers and riggers and sailmakers, whose hands actually built these things, and whose names appear in no history at all. They made, out of wood and rope and canvas, machines that reached a peak of speed under sail that would stand for a century and more. They pushed a set of ancient materials right to the edge of the possible, and for a few years they made the fastest, most beautiful ships the world had ever seen. And then the age that needed them ended, and they and their work faded together into memory. The record stood for 135 years. The names of the men who built the ships did not survive even a fraction of that. But every one of those impossible passages, every record run, every 22-knot afternoon with the water roaring past the hull, was theirs, made by their hands. And I think it is worth remembering that behind the beautiful ships and the famous captains stood a whole yard full of forgotten men who actually built the wind machines that flew. When I think of them, I do not picture the launching day crowds or the record headlines. I picture the yard in the New England winter, the frozen ground, the smell of tar and fresh-cut oak, and a shipwright bent over a great curved timber with an adze. Shaping by eye a line that would help a ship fly across the world, a man who would never sail on her, never see San Francisco, never have his name attached to the record she set, and who went home each night to a modest house and came back each morning to shape the next timber. That man, and the hundreds like him in that yard, and in the other great yards of the coast, made the fastest and most beautiful ships the world had ever seen, at the very peak and the very end of an art, thousands of years old. They did not know they were at the end. They thought, like everyone, that they were building the future. They were actually building the magnificent close of the past. And the ships they made still race, in every painting and every model and every imagination that thrills to the image of a clipper under full sail, carrying, though almost no one now remembers it, the invisible signature of the forgotten hands that built them. That signature is in the lines. It is in the speed. It is in the beauty. You just have to know that it is there. And to say, when you see one of those glorious ships, that men made this, real men, with their hands, and were then forgotten by the very glory they created. That is the debt we owe them, and it is a small one only to remember. The clippers are gone. Every last one of the great ones, sunk or burned or broken up for their timber more than a century ago. But the fact of them remains. The astonishing fact that ordinary men, with wood and rope and canvas and their own two hands, once built ships that outran everything the world could offer for 135 years. They did that. Not the captains alone, not McKay alone. The men in the yard did that, and then the tide of history carried their names away and left only the beauty behind. The least we can do is look at that beauty and know whose it truly was. One more thing. If you want to be part of the inner circle on this channel, join Final Boss for $9.99 a month. Public shout-out in upcoming videos, members-only investigations, plus everything from Boss tier. Link in description. See you in the next one.